sense on this issue. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what she can do to increase that coalition of concern, to relay the thoughts to the UK Government and to get them to see sense on this issue and pay up for our public services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I agree with Kevin Stewart that that coalition of concern, as he describes it, is very important to keep the pressure up on the UK Government and the Treasury. Because, as I set out in my answers, the changes and the hike to employer national insurance contributions does place a higher burden on businesses, the public sector and the third sector, and is fundamentally a tax on jobs that will impact the Scottish economy. And my concern, particularly around those commission services, that at the end of the day it will impact on the public sector, and that is something that is not acceptable.
Absolutely. The briefest of question 8, Christine Graham.
I've anticipated that, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what research it has recently completed into the efficacy and standardisation of the presumption of inclusion in mainstream education.
Minister Natalie Donanis.
Our young people should learn in the environment that best suits their needs, and we continue to seek ways to improve the experience of inclusion for all of our young people, and the draft budget sets out an additional £29 million for additional support needs. Our most recent relevant analysis undertaken through the Morgan Review in 2020 found no deficit in the legislative framework for additional support for learning. Indeed, the Standards in Scotland Schools Act 2000 has clear exceptions on the presumption of mainstream education to enable children and young people to learn in a special school or in a specialist unit if that best suits their needs.
Christine Graham.
Yes, I thank the Minister for her answer and make it clear I fully support the presumption on inclusion introduced in legislation over 2 decades ago. However, I do have several cases where it simply is not working either in the interests of the child or in the interests of the class, and I know it's a balance. So can I just ask the Minister to keep this under review, because we want the child and the class to get the best out of the situation?
Briefly, Minister.
Thank you. Well, last year's Education, Children and Young People Committee led an inquiry into additional support for learning, considered these issues thoroughly. We accepted the committee's recommendations on this point and are taking further action, and I will keep the points that Ms Graham raises in mind.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions. At question number 1, I call Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite sustained efforts by my party, Scotland's Parliament does not want to talk about a case that everyone across Scotland is talking about. So we're going to talk about that right now. A female nurse with 30 years of dedicated service to the NHS faces the sack for her concerns about a man using a women's changing room. The Employment Tribunal will rule in due course, but there is absolutely no reason why MSPs cannot discuss the wider issues. Women's spaces must be for women and girls. So does John Swinney agree that every woman in Scotland should be entitled to this and to say this without losing their job?
First Minister.
So before I answer Russell Finlay's question, I just want to take this opportunity to place on record the fact that on Monday I will attend a commemoration service in Edinburgh to mark the 3rd anniversary of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I am certain when I go to that, I will go there with the wholehearted support of every member of this Parliament who is repulsed by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. I have, of course, been paying very close attention to the issues raised by Mr Finlay and by Conservative members in Parliament, and the Government has taken the view that we cannot comment on the ongoing proceedings that Mr Finlay raises. The reason for that is set out in Section 1 of the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act 2008, which at Section 1, under the title of Guaranteed of Continued Judicial Independence, it says that the following persons must uphold the continued independence of the judiciary: A, the First Minister; B, the Lord Advocate; C, the Scottish Ministers; D, members of the Scottish Parliament. It goes on at subsection 2 to say, in particular, the First Minister the Lord Advocate and the Scottish ministers must not seek to influence judicial decisions through any special access to the judiciary. Now, if I was to comment on this case, I would be in danger of breaking the law. And I believe in the rule of law, and nobody will persuade me to break the rule of law in this Parliament. No questioning from Mr Finlay, no barracking, no heckling, nothing will stop me from protecting the right to ensure that the law is upheld in this country. The guidance that is in place in relation to the issues that Mr Finlay raises on a general level explains as follows. The Equality Act 2010 does allow the provision to exclude a trans person from single or separate-sex facilities. These kinds of decisions must be made on a case-by-case basis. Managers must balance the needs of the trans person to use this facility against the needs of other members of staff. They should also consider if other staff members will experience any disadvantage if the trans person is allowed to use the facilities. That is the position and guidance supported by law, and I hope that answers Mr Finlay's question.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you. I also look forward to attending the memorial service on Monday, and I wholeheartedly agree with the First Minister's comments in that regard. We can indeed talk about the generalities of this case, despite the First Minister's selective legal interpretations. The SNP Health Secretary was warned directly last year about the NHS ignoring women's fundamental rights under the Equality Act, but he did nothing about it. And just weeks ago, Scotland's NHS published what it describes as a gender transitioning guide. This official document confirms that women's rights to single-sex spaces are not protected in the NHS. But the document has now disappeared from the NHS website. The page appears to have been deleted. So has this guidance been scrapped? And if it has not, will John Swinney do so?
First Minister.
I don't think it's good enough for Russell Finlay to say that I've selectively expressed the basis of the position that I take that I cannot comment on live legal proceedings, because the law requires me not to do so. And if Russell Finlay cannot respect that and accept that, then I think the Conservative Party is in a pretty dismal place if that is their position today. And I come back to the point that I made in my first answer, that the guidance, and I'm reading from the guidance that Mr Finlay is talking about, the Equality Act 2010 does allow the provision to exclude a trans person from single or separate-sex facilities. These kinds of decisions must be made on a case-by-case basis. Managers must balance the needs of the trans person to use this facility against the needs of other members of staff. They should also consider if other staff members will experience any disadvantage if the trans person is allowed to use the facilities. Now, that's the second time I've put that on the record, openly and candidly to Parliament. Mr Finlay should now start to adjust his questions, because I've answered the point that he's put to me.
Russell Finlay.
I'm going to repeat this again, and I'll do it very slowly for the First Minister's benefit. At no point have I asked him to comment on this specific case, although I do note that his Health Secretary did exactly that yesterday. Now, this madness isn't just happening within the NHS. It's in schools, it's in prisons, it's in rape crisis centres. Female pupils too scared to use shared toilets over fear of sexual intimidation or assault. A male prisoner serving life for murder in a women's prison and able to get an operation to reduce his Adam's apple. Rape victims being told they are bigots for wanting to know the sex of their counsellor. Scotland's public services waste too much time, energy and money on this nonsense, all because of SNP gender self-ID policy and legislation with the backing of Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens. And yesterday, astonishingly, John Swinney said that he has no regrets. Does he really have no regrets about causing all this harm to women and all this cost to taxpayers?
First Minister.
I think the point that Mr Finlay skates past is the significance of the Equality Act 2010, which was enshrined, because it has to be enshrined, because we can't change the law, because it's a reserved piece of legislation, is enshrined in the legislation that this Parliament passed on gender recognition. So I've quoted to Mr Finlay the fact that the Equality Act 2010 makes provision for there to be single or separate sex facilities and for those rights to be put into practice and into place. I don't know why Mr Finlay is so determined to just keep pursuing this line of argument, which is about sowing division in our society, when the legal position is absolutely crystal clear that the Equality Act protects the ability to have single-sex spaces in our country, and Mr Finlay should accept that.
Russell Finlay.
Well, John Swinney, there's two things happening here. Either he's in a state of complete denial or he's a very good actor. I'm not sure which. The SNP focus on the issue of gender has harmed Scotland's public services. They've put their ideology before the rights of women and girls, but also before NHS waiting lists, before justice for victims, before our children's education. Anna Sarwar and the Lib Dem leader are just as culpable as the SNP. Their collective support for this nonsense confirms how utterly disconnected Parliament has become from the real world. My party believes all government time and money should be devoted to fixing Scotland's public services, not on radical fringe policies. And that's where we proudly stand. So what about John Swinney? Will he do the right thing and bin his gender ideology that is causing so much harm to our country?
First Minister.
Again, Mr Finlay ignores the point I've put to him about the significance of the Equality Act and the obligation and the underpinning of all legislation and its requirements to be compatible with the Equality Act 2010. Now, Mr Finlay asked me about my priorities, and my priorities are absolutely crystal clear. I'm in office to improve the lives of the people of Scotland by making sure that we eradicate child poverty, by making sure that we grow the economy, by making sure we make the transition to net zero and make sure that we strengthen the public services of Scotland. We've got a budget before this Parliament next Tuesday that will turn this into effect. The people who are standing in the way of that budget being approved to improve the lives of the people of Scotland, the people that are standing in the way of that budget being approved.
Let's hear the First Minister.
The people that are standing in the way of that budget being approved, the people that are not interested in improving the lives of the people of Scotland, are the Conservative Party and their parade in front of Nigel Farage, who support their courting in Scotland today. So I am going to take no lessons from Russell Finlay, who has no interest in the prospects and the future of the people of Scotland. He's only here to support division. I'm here to bring people together.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, 1 in 6 Scots are on an NHS waiting list. There is an NHS crisis with lives being lost. So when will John Swinney, Neil Gray and this SNP government stop focusing on disciplining a nurse and instead focus on supporting NHS staff, getting patients treated, clearing the backlogs, stopping the need for patients to spend thousands of pounds to go private, and ending the ATM rush for a GP appointment?
First Minister.
Well, Presiding Officer, if Mr Sarwar had been following the speech that I delivered a few weeks ago, which I think he did because he raised some of these issues with me before, he would know that I'm absolutely focused on tackling the issue of waiting times. I'm absolutely focused on improving access to the National Health Service. I'm absolutely focused on making sure that the needs of the people of Scotland are met by the National Health Service. That's why my budget on Tuesday will include a record settlement for the National Health Service. And Mr Sarwar, as things stand just now, but at the rate at which he's flip-flopping on his positions on a daily basis, is not proposing to support the budget on Tuesday.
Absolutely.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, John Swinney has had 18 years to get to grips with the issues in Scotland, and the fact is SNP incompetence has consequences. They promised 800 more GPs, but whole-time equivalent GPs has actually fallen by over 200. Everyone across the country will know the ATM rush for a GP appointment. Many left hanging for hours, but getting nowhere. And some will be sick of the daily texts that read, "Please don't call, there are no appointments left, call tomorrow or go to A&E." And it all comes back to the SNP's failure to get to grips with waiting times. As one GP put it to me, a patient waiting 2 years for a hip replacement, rather than the legal 12 weeks, means they are repeatedly presenting at a GP practice for pain relief, just adding further pressure and demand on our NHS. So why can't John Swinney see that his SNP government has plunged our NHS into this vicious cycle?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the number of GPs per head of population in Scotland stands at 82. In England it's 64, in Wales it's 67, and in Northern Ireland it's 75. And there are more GPs available in Scotland as a consequence of the investment the government has made, with 307 GPs recruited or added since 2007. And we have commitments to increase the number of GPs, and we are working to deliver against that. Now, of course, the whole issue of the performance of the National Health Service comes down to the way in which we can tackle waiting times. And on the most recent data that's available, between October 2023 and September 2024, there was a 9.5% increase in procedures undertaken within the National Health Service. Now, that's really welcome. And over the weekend, Mr Sarwar was making a big thing about the increase in activity in England and Wales. And the increase in England and Wales since the Labour government came in has been 7.6%. But we've seen an increase and that's against a backdrop of the fact that there was strike action in England. So no wonder the number of procedures have increased in England, because there was strike action under the Tories. In Scotland, we've got a 9.5% increase in procedures, and we should welcome that today. And I'm surprised Mr Sarwar hasn't done so.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, more than 800,000 Scots on an NHS waiting list, and that's the best answer John Swinney can give. And the reality is, he can't even accept the problem, let alone fix it. And let me give him an example, and perhaps the Health Secretary should listen. I know he's been sidelined, but perhaps he should listen to this. An expectant mother in South Edinburgh, who should have had a GP-organised midwife appointment within 8 weeks, was instead left waiting months for an appointment. She said, "I had to call the GP surgery over 50 times to try and get through at 8 AM. It's not sustainable." This is the harsh reality of healthcare under the SNP. Pregnant women left anxiously waiting, people in pain forced to go to A&E, and people unable to work because they can't get the treatment they need. And that's why this week I've set out my plan to end the ATM rush for a GP appointment, ensuring every Scot who needs to be seen is seen in a GP surgery within 48 hours. And isn't the truth that John Swinney can't see the problem because he created the problem, and he can't fix our NHS because his SNP government broke it?
First Minister.
Well, on Tuesday, in the budget that Anna Sarwar currently is not going to support, there will be an increase in the resources available for general practice to the tune of £13.6 million. So on Tuesday, Anna Sarwar and his colleagues can do the right thing, and they can vote for the budget to start making the progress that apparently he is interested in making. Now, Mr Sarwar set out his commitments about GP appointments. He set out the plans and the promises that he's going to make. But let's look at the record of the Labour Party on the delivery of their promises. Mr Sarwar stood beside me in a Scottish television debate and promised he would save Grangemouth. And the Labour government hasn't lifted a finger to save Grangemouth. They promised justice for the WASPy women, and they turned their backs on the WASPy women. They promised GB Energy would bring down energy bills, and energy bills have gone up. They promised jobs and stability, and employers' national insurance contributions have gone up. The one thing we can conclude is that Labour say one thing before the election and then they don't deliver on it after the election, and people should remember that in Scotland.
Question number 3, Lorna Slater.
This week, US Vice President J.D. Vance has spread misinformation about laws made in this Scottish Parliament. His claims about my colleague Gillian Mackay's Safe Access Zones Act are grossly misleading. Emboldened by Mr Vance's comments, anti-choice groups have already started to target patients outside the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, with more actions planned in coming weeks. Last summer, members of this Parliament agreed overwhelmingly that everyone should be able to access abortion services free from harassment. What is the First Minister doing to correct false claims and provide clarity to the public on what buffer zones mean for them? And how will he protect safe access to healthcare in Scotland?
First Minister.
President Officer, I recognise the seriousness of the points that Lorna Slater puts to me, and let me just say that on the issues in relation to protests yesterday, these are obviously live issues in the criminal justice system, so I will not comment on those particular issues for the same reasons that I said to Russell Finlay earlier on. Now, obviously, the remarks made by the Vice President of the United States last week about the Safe Access Zones legislation in Scotland were untrue. They were incorrect. And I'm grateful to Lorna Slater for providing the opportunity for me to say that to Parliament openly and to clarify that position. There is the idea that private prayer in an individual's home is in any way contradicted or constrained by this legislation is just not correct. In relation to Lorna Slater's point to me about what is the government doing on these issues, ahead of the Act coming into force, we published clear guidance on both NHS Inform and the Scottish Government website, and we issued letters to householders who were affected by the zones about what the Act meant for their localities. And I would urge anyone with questions to read the online guidance that's available.
Yeah. Thank you. Question, Lorna Slater.
The White House manufactures mistruths, tech billionaires profit from them, and bad faith actors spread them. Disinformation is playing an increasingly dangerous role in our communities and in our global politics. Promoting lies and misinformation at home and abroad can have serious consequences for all our communities. Friendly countries do not tell lies about each other. Does the First Minister agree that political leaders everywhere must stand up to disinformation? And will he ask Keir Starmer to demand an urgent apology from the White House when the Prime Minister meets Trump next week?
First Minister.
President Officer, obviously I think the Prime Minister is well able to engage in dialogue with the President of the United States, and I will obviously I very much welcome the engagement of the Prime Minister in the European dialogue that took place earlier on this week on the situation in Ukraine, which I think was a very welcome step. Yeah. And I welcome what the Prime Minister said last night on the Ukrainian situation into the bargain. In the general point that Lorna Slater makes to me, I think that we are living in an era where disinformation is regularly circulated in our political discourse. Yeah. I think it is harming our political discourse. I think we have plenty of evidence of it in this Parliament, and I certainly want to be one of those individuals who stands up for the clarity of information, who speaks truth to Parliament and expresses in detail. Yes, Jackie Bailey, seriously, speaking truth to Parliament, that's what I'm about. The Labour Party might want to deceive. Well,
members, let's hear the First Minister.
Well, for some reason, on an issue where we are tackling disinformation in our society, Jackie Bailey believes that she should question the integrity of the First Minister speaking truth to Parliament, which I do at all times. And Jackie Bailey, and no other member can come to this Parliament and say otherwise, and it's a disgrace that such behaviour takes place in this Parliament.
Thank you. Before we move to question 4, I would remind all members that they should not be shouting from their seats. And I call Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the recent Labour Market Outlook survey by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development on UK business confidence.
First Minister.
President Officer, this survey of employers across the UK shows just how damaging the Labour Government's decision to raise employer national insurance contributions is going to be, with nearly a third saying they might have to cut jobs and over 40% needing to raise prices to cope with the additional costs. That, of course, affects consumers who are still struggling with the cost of living pressures. It demonstrates further how short-sighted and harmful this Labour tax hike is. It is effectively a tax on jobs.
Claire Adamson.
Does the First Minister share my concern that while the tax on jobs is causing business confidence to plummet, it is having an absolutely devastating effect on our third sector and charity organisations, people who do vital work in our constituencies to help people who are vulnerable, in poverty, in recovery, and who are absolutely essential to the well-being of Scotland?
First Minister.
I understand entirely the point that Claire Adamson puts to me, and I sympathise with it. We are very concerned within Government about the impact on all sectors of the economy, but especially on the charitable sector and the third sector, and particularly where we are very concerned about the impact the national insurance contribution increases will have on the social care sector, which is very much in the organisations that Claire Adamson raises with me today. So we have put these concerns to the United Kingdom Government, as the Finance Secretary said just in general questions before we started First Minister's questions, and we will continue to do so.
Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Audit Scotland has confirmed that between 2017 and 2022, hard-pressed Scottish taxpayers paid £3.4 billion more in tax as a result of his government's high-tax agenda. But slower economic growth in Scotland means the net benefit to the Scottish budget over the same period is just £629 million, £2.6 billion effectively disappearing down John Swinney's drain. So when will the First Minister wake up to the simple fact that everyone else can see, that the SNP and now Labour's low-growth, high-tax policies have badly backfired?
First Minister.
Well, what I'd say to Craig Hoy is that more people are coming to live in Scotland than are leaving Scotland. Yeah, that's official data. We are seeing, if we followed the Conservative approach to public expenditure, we would have to cut public expenditure by £1 billion, and the Conservatives have not come up with a scrap of evidence as to how that would be done. They have, as I've pointed out before, a £950 billion gaping hole in their tax proposals. And of course, on Tuesday, Parliament will have the opportunity to support a budget that invests in housing, in the economy, in growth within our public services, in the National Health Service, in education, in culture. And as things stand just now, the Conservatives are going to vote against all of that benefit for the people of Scotland. Yeah.
Thank you. Question number 5, Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether he will provide an update on the Scottish Government's plans to update the School Premises General Requirements and Standards Scotland Regulations 1967. First Minister.
The Government is committed to ensuring our school environments support every child and young person to reach their full potential for learning. The School Premises Regulations prescribe the broad minimum standards that school buildings must meet and were last updated in 1979. It is therefore this Government's intention to refresh and modernise the regulations to ensure that they meet the needs of pupils and schools in Scotland, and a consultation will take place this year.
Pam Gossel.
I thank the First Minister for his response. Presiding Officer, too many times in this chamber we've heard the SNP dismiss concerns about the safety of women and girls. Instead of safeguarding single-sex spaces, such as school toilets, the SNP has spent years trying to undermine them, all in the name of dangerous gender ideology. The case of Sandy Peggy has revealed that the SNP's dismissive attitude towards women's safety has well and truly infected Scotland's public bodies. The lack of single-sex facilities puts the rights and safety of women and girls at risk, whether that is girls filmed in school toilets or women being forced to share changing rooms with biological males. So does the First Minister regret supporting Nicola Sturgeon's reckless self-ID law? And does he agree with me that single-sex facilities in schools should be a basic right for female pupils and staff?
First Minister.
Well, the regulations that Pam Gosal is talking about were last updated in 1979, and my recollection is that in 1979 there was a Conservative government. Now, so all of the issues that are being taken forward in relation to this regulated environment are in age-old regulation that I think we need to review, and that's what the question was about. Second point I would make is that local authorities are responsible for the design of their schools, and they take those forward in consultation and dialogue with their school community, and I'd expect them to do exactly that. And the final point I would make is that this government, as a consequence of our investment programme, has increased the proportion of schools in good or satisfactory condition from the 62.7% that we inherited in 2007 from the Labour and Liberal Executive to 91.7% in 2024, which is a tribute to the public sector investment this government has presided over.
Thank you. Question number 6, Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government has taken to reduce the disability employment gap.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is committed to halving the disability employment gap. In 2023, the employment rate for disabled people was 52.7%, exceeding our first interim target by 2.7%. Through the implementation of our Fair Work Action Plan, we've reduced barriers and improved recruitment and retention of disabled people, but we will of course take further actions, but have to be cognizant of the fact that we have only limited powers in this area, as employment powers are reserved to the United Kingdom Government.
Colin Smith.
The disability employment gap shamefully remains above 40% in Dumfries and Galloway. Yet the future of the Usual Place Community Cafe in Dumfries, which provides life-changing opportunities for young people with disabilities and additional support needs, helping many into employment, is in doubt because of difficulty securing adequate funding. Now, I know the First Minister is familiar with this project, so will he give a commitment that the Government and its agencies will urgently consider what support it can give to avoid the current proposed redundancies at the Usual Place, and will he arrange for the Cabinet Secretary to meet with myself and a cross-party group of MSPs from South Scotland to discuss how together we can help secure the long-term future of this transformative project and the futures of so many young people who depend upon it?
First Minister.
As Mr Smith knows, I'm very familiar with the Usual Place. It's an organisation I respect enormously. I respect the impact that it has on the lives of young people. So I've been concerned to read of the information, and I'm familiar with the challenges that they face. I think for completeness, I should say, and I don't make this point pejoratively, but it is the hard reality of what we're dealing with, the increase in national insurance contributions has been cited by the company as a contributory factor towards their difficulties. But I am committed to making sure that we do all that we can to support the Usual Place, subject of course to all of the normal processes that we have to go through, and I give them the commitment that I will encourage and motivate our agencies to make sure that they do exactly that.
Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recognise the First Minister's personal commitment to this project, and I wonder if he would go one better and come to Dumfries and meet with the young people and their families at the heart of this project and see first-hand how life-changing it is, and maybe he'll bring his famed deal-making skills and try and pull together a positive future plan for the organisation.
First Minister.
I should have said in relation to Colin Smith, I was very happy for ministers to engage on that, but if if Oliver Mundell is inviting me to go to Dumfries to have that discussion, I will certainly do all that I can to do that. He'll appreciate there are many pressures in my diary, but I will try to do that as early as I possibly can do. And my famous deal-making skills will be available that day. And of course, they could have an early outing on Tuesday by having Mr Mundell. And I would just encourage Mr Mundell, if he's in a somewhat potentially reckless position now, since he's standing down at the next election, I would encourage him to break the whip and vote for the government's budget on Tuesday.
We move to general and constituency supplementaries, and I call Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has supported Ukrainian refugees since the beginning of Putin's illegal aggression on Ukraine. Can the First Minister confirm that Scotland's support for Ukrainian people living here will continue? And will he make clear today that the Scottish Government continues to condemn Russian aggression and that we stand by the people of Ukraine's rights to freedom, democracy and self-determination?
First Minister.
I associate myself entirely with Kevin Stewart's position and comments in relation to the illegal invasion of Ukraine. Russian aggression needs to be repelled, and the territorial integrity and the independence of Ukraine must be asserted. We as a country have, and this has had cross-party support, have done a lot to welcome Ukrainian refugees to Scotland. I express our solidarity with them today and indicate that the Government will do all that it can to ensure their safety and security here in Scotland.
Thank you. Edward Mountain.
Presiding Officer, First Minister, the Cairngorm Funicular Railway opened actually in January 23 after 4 years of repairs, 4 years that cost £25 million. It closed months later because the repairs were defective, and it's remained closed ever since. Now, we were told in November that it would reopen for the 24 season. That became the 4th of December, the 20th of December, early January, early February, in time for the school holidays, none of which happened. In fact, it's remained closed. And this incompetence of HIE has cost the taxpayers and local businesses millions of pounds. After nearly 6 years of incompetence, surely the First Minister will support my calls for an inquiry into this fiasco and now remove HIE from the management of our Cairngorm Mountain.
First Minister.
This is a very difficult project in very challenging conditions. I think the fact that it's a funicular railway in the Cairngorm Mountains is an indication of its challenge and difficulty. I've got the utmost confidence in Highlands Islands Enterprise. I think they're an excellent organisation. They command my total confidence. I think they're well led. I think they're committed to doing good things for the Highlands and Islands, and I have absolutely no intention of pursuing the approach suggested by Mr Mountain. I can assure him that HIE are fully focused on securing the reopening of the funicular railway, and it would be a great boost to the community in and around the Aviemore area, and I know that it's got the attention and priority of Highlands Islands Enterprise.
Rhoda Grant.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister will be aware that dangerous levels of radon gas have been recorded in parts of the Inverness Justice Centre. This radioactive gas is known to cause cancer. I understand that 2 areas of the building are subject to time-based access restrictions. However, other parts of the building staff are working and they remain there working full-time. Can I ask the First Minister what he's doing to resolve this difficult situation and keep staff and visitors to the Justice Centre safe?
First Minister.
Well, the absolute requirement must be that all health and safety legislation in relation to access to the building, while this issue exists, must be followed. So that's the first assurance that I give to Rhoda Grant, that those requirements must be absolutely followed. The second point is that obviously there are issues that are having to be addressed about the environment in the building. Those will be taken forward by the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, and I'm very happy to provide Rhoda Grant with an update on the developments that are taking place to ensure that the fundamental issues are remedied.
Keith Brown.
The First Minister will be aware that the UK Treasury has forecast that energy bills could soar by over £100 in April. The third rise, in fact, since Labour came to power, and that's despite Labour's election promise that they would cut household energy bills by £300. Does the First Minister share my concern about what appears to be yet another broken election promise from Anas Sarwar's Westminster bosses? And will he join me in calling on the UK Government to take urgent action to support families across Scotland with energy costs ahead of the next energy cap announcement expected next week?
First Minister.
I agree with Mr Brown. The Labour Party promised a reduction of £300 in energy bills right away, and we know from what's happened since the election, and we know from the comments made by the chair of GB Energy, that GB Energy will not be delivering reductions in energy bills anytime soon. So I think Mr Brown raises an important point that Scotland should be aware of, that the Labour Party says one thing before an election to get elected and then does another after the election, and people should be wary of the promises from the Labour Party.
Absolutely. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Nearly every public health indicator for Scotland is concerning. It's getting worse, with pressure on our health service increasing week to week, it seems. We now have a report indicating a shock rise in overweight Scottish youngsters as young as 2 being referred to for specialist obesity treatment. Scotland is the most obese country in Europe, costing the Scots economy £5.3 billion, according to an ESTA report. Yet the Scottish Government consistently cut the budget of those organisations who are best placed to reverse this trend. We learn once again that Sport Scotland will have their budgets cut and are looking to cut staff, and there's the continual erosion of council facilities. First Minister, there is much talk of a preventative agenda, but evidence says that little more than empty rhetoric. Does the Scottish Government not realise that by continually eroding opportunity to adopt a healthier lifestyle, all the Scottish Government is doing is heaping ever more pressure on our health service and the health service budget?
First Minister.
My government follows an approach which is designed to support early intervention to address the important issues that Brian Whittle puts to me. But let me just point out to Parliament that Brian Whittle is arguing for more money to be spent on sport and more money to be spent on local government. Now, well, Mr Whittle has just asked me a question which has asked for more money for sport and more money for local government. Now, the Government has a budget before Parliament on Tuesday. Mr Whittle proposes to vote against that, and his party wants us to cut public spending by £1 billion. Now, this is just completely and utterly incoherent. Yes. So, if Mr Whittle wants to make sure a budget, the Government's bringing forward a budget which increases local authority expenditure, why can't Mr Whittle, if he wants to carry these things through, vote for the Government's budget and try and make things happen in Scotland?
Absolutely. Ben McPherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today is World Cholangiocarcinoma Day. For those unaware, it is a rare and aggressive type of cancer that develops in the bile duct. Can I ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government and NHS Scotland are supporting those diagnosed with the condition and raising awareness of it, and whether the Scottish Government will give consideration to providing full NHS funding for the geomatic testing necessary for patients to access all Scottish Medical Consortium approved therapies?
First Minister.
I recognise the importance of the point that Ben McPherson raises with me, and the Government's approach is directed through the Detect Cancer Earlier programme, in which we are committed to raising awareness of possible cancer symptoms, and our new primary care cancer education platform, Gateway C, provides education and tools to support earlier diagnosis efforts and decision-making at the point of referral. We recognise that significant work is needed to develop the genomic testing that's available, including for bile duct cancer, and we have been working closely with partners to identify how this expanded testing can be commissioned and implemented in the National Health Service.
Finlay Carson.
Early last week, my constituents in Galloway were outraged and astonished at the utterly shameful decision by Scottish ministers to grant consent for a massive pylon route in the heart of some of the most beautiful landscapes in Scotland and indeed the world. Yet again an example of rural Scotland carrying a disproportionate weight of delivering net zero. Can the First Minister justify the decision to approve Spain's plan for this major power line through an area of outstanding beauty, despite the public inquiry, reporters' recommendation and overwhelming local opposition? And explain how this aligns with the Scottish Government's commitment to promoting Galloway's environmental assets and its possible designation as a national park?
First Minister.
I understand the points that Mr Carson puts to me. But what the Government has got to be mindful of is the need to take decisions that will ensure we have sufficiently strong and robust power networks to meet the needs of the population in every part of Scotland. And that's the process of discussion and dialogue that the Government is engaged with. We obviously engage substantively with communities, with local authorities on these questions, but there will be difficult decisions have to be arrived at in ensuring that we have adequate energy security and the appropriate infrastructure within our country.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, Cole Thompson is 12 years old and lives with a severe form of drug-resistant epilepsy. Medical cannabis is keeping him alive, but his mum, Lisa Quarrell, is running out of funds to pay for Bedrolite privately. The NHS has made a small number of exceptions in England and England and Northern Ireland for children in a similar situation, but no such help in Scotland as yet, despite the best efforts of the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, who has been very helpful. Time is running out, so will the First Minister ask the Health Secretary to urgently meet with me and Cole's mum to explore all possible options to get Cole the support that he needs?
First Minister.
I'm certainly happy for that discussion to take place. I know the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer will have been of assistance in these matters and will have done what can be done, but the Health Secretary will meet with Monica Lennon and with Cole's mum, and we'll see what we can do to address the situation.
Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister share my disbelief and outrage regarding the UK Government consulting on giving English whisky a geographical indication, the same definition as Scottish single malt? If approved, this move, entirely enabled by Brexit, would trample on the reputation and tradition of our whisky industry and Scottish brand. Does he also agree with the Scottish Whisky Association that the integrity of our single malt would be damaged by inferior whisky product, potentially harming industry, jobs and trade, including in the new distilleries in the south of Scotland and indeed across wider Scotland?
First Minister.
I share the concerns that have been expressed by Emma Harper, and they've also been expressed by the Scottish Whisky Association, who I know understand and promote and engage substantively across Parliament about the importance of the designation of Scotch whisky, which enables it to have such a powerful position within the international marketplace. So I can assure Emma Harper that the Government will make all necessary representations on this issue to protect the identity and the character of Scotch whisky.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a member's business debate in the name of Kenneth Gibson, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and the gallery to do so.
Thank you. Could I ask our visitors in the gallery, who are most welcome in our Parliament, to please, if they're leaving the gallery, do so quickly and quietly, as we're about to move into the next part of our business. And the next item of business, in fact, is the members' business debate on motion 16287 in the name of Kenneth Gibson on the ongoing impact of PFI PPP on Scotland's public finances. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. I call on Kenneth Gibson to open the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I say to Graham Simpson, come on in, the water's lovely. I thank Ross Greer, Maggie Chapman and my SNP colleagues whose signatures ensured this motion could be debated, and I apologise for narrowing the motion. Updated figures claimed that North Ayrshire Council actually will end up paying £3.3 million more than the motion suggests. In August, the Financial Times reported that the Chancellor was considering funding the £9 billion Thames crossing using a private finance initiative-style funding arrangement. NHS England Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard has made similar suggestions for the NHS. This should send a shiver down the spine of everyone who recalls the New Labour years. PFI was introduced by John Major's Tory government in 1992. The idea was that private companies would fund, build and operate public infrastructure using special-purpose vehicles involving a consortium of companies in return for long-term payments from the public sector. Sold as a way to finance public projects without immediate capital spend from government, its real purpose was to keep UK government debt off the books to comply with debt and limitations set out in the Maastricht Treaty of 1991. In Scotland, PFI began under Secretary of State for Scotland Michael Forsyth MP. The publication of A Partnership for Scotland in 1996 gave the game away by outlining the scope for higher profits the private sector would have access to. Exemplifying the worst of the pre-devolution political order, this was imposed despite widespread opposition from Scottish civic society, trade unions and every political party bar the Tories. The 85 SPVs running Scotland's PFIs have 51 shareholders. Only 7 companies own more than half the stock and debt: Barclays, Innisfree, Bilfinger Berger, Balfour Beatty, ABN AMRO, John Laing and HISL. PFI was derided for waste, poor value for money and flexibility, particularly in reference to highly complex contract termination procedures and the huge profits generated. However, there is no zealot like a convert. Having railed against PFI in opposition, Labour in office opened the floodgates with an evangelical enthusiasm few could have foreseen. When New Labour proposed changes to reinvigorate PFI, the unconcealed glee of financiers should have been an early warning sign. Under the new regime, the private sector would be allowed to earn profits without bearing any risks. The new PFI contracts, renamed public-private partnerships, lack clauses allowing the government to recoup windfall profits. Under these lucrative terms, the private sector gorged itself on PPP deals, while Labour boasted that projects worth £14 billion would be agreed by the end of 1999. All while local authority capital budgets were cut and Chancellor Gordon Brown stuck to Tory spending rules. PPP fervour trickled down the Labour Party as parliamentarians, too, amazed by the level of investment, not concerned enough to ask many questions. In this Parliament's first ever SNP-led opposition debate on 24th of June 1999, Labour, Tory and Lib Dem MSPs came out to bat for PPP. Speaking in that debate, I took 7 interventions from such illustrious colleagues as Jack McConnell, David McCletchie and Keith Raffin. Protests about its obvious flaws were dismissed with claims that if someone was against PPP, they must also be opposed to the new school or hospital in their area. Thus, Labour blithely condemned Scottish public services to unprecedented debt levels for decades. Even now, nearly 18 years after Labour left office at Holyrood, the extent of their PPP profligacy is staggering. Labour built a debt mountain so high we have yet to reach the top, but we will soon. Annual payments are still rising and will peak at an eye-watering £1,250 million this coming financial year. Total remaining PPP debt in Scotland is projected at £12,483 million from 25-26. North Ayrshire Council will have to pay over £16 million next year for full... In a second. North Ayrshire Council will have to pay over £16 million next year for 4 secondary schools built nearly 2 decades ago. Schools that still had snagging problems 2 years after completion. That sum limits the Council's ability to invest in jobs and services, and by the time the contract ends in 2038, it will have cost £443.4 million for schools worth £83 million. happy to take an intervention.
Misha Thompson.
I thank the member very much for taking an intervention. He's making a splendid speech. I remember my time in Westminster where Meg Hillier, who was at that point the convener or chair of the Public Accounts Committee, noting that the issue of debt of this type of contracts was primarily to remove it from the balance sheet of UK PLC because neither government wanted the people to know just how broke the UK was. Would you agree with me? Kenneth Gibson?
Well, I agree, and I did touch on that earlier in my speech, and I'll touch on it later on. Now, Kilmarnock Prison was built for £32 million when it went into operation in 1999. By the time the contract ended last year, taxpayers had shelled out £367.64 million. The contract for a £45.5 million wastewater project in Leavenmouth required an astonishing £721.2 million in repayments, a shocking 16 times the original cost. PPP remains a millstone around the neck of Scotland's public services. To put its impact on local authority finances into perspective, 31 pence in every pound of council tax raised in North Ayrshire goes towards the council's PPP obligations. And in Inverclyde, Stuart McMillan will be interested to know that it's 45 pence, and in Clackmannanshire, 52 pence in the pound. And as Michael Mara is the only Labour member present in the chamber just now, I will advise that Dundee City, it's 32.4% of all council tax raised will actually go in PPP payments this current year. In many cases, the public won't even own the buildings by the time the contracts end. Research by BBC Scotland revealed there are 11 PPP contracts expiring where the public sector will have to shell out tens of millions to actually own the buildings it spent years paying through the nose for. Thankfully, once the government and the SNP took swift action to abolish PPP through the non-profit distribution model, schools and hospital construction projects were financed through conventional means or via the Scottish Futures Trust, with private profits capped at 5% and surpluses directed to the public sector. NPD projects averaged 58% of the repayment cost of a PPP project, most of the costs going on interest payments. Had the projects funded through NPD been carried out under PPP, the Scottish taxpayer have been on the hook for an additional £7,735 million over the life of these contracts. Today's debate is not just a history lesson or a trip down memory lane, it's a warning. While our current Chancellor's CV may not be as impressive as Gordon Brown's, the situation she finds herself in has parallels. A Labour Party which came to power by tacking to the centre and beyond, unsure of what it believes in, promising investment to repair Britain's crumbling infrastructure, balanced against self-imposed fiscal rules aimed at wooing the city. And a large enough parliamentary majority to override scrutiny or backbench rebellions, albeit that 19 newly elected Labour MPs have already been expelled, suspended or resigned. The attractiveness of PFI or PPP to governments looking to keep debt off book diminished as Eurostat rules on accounting for EU member states led to the majority of such projects being classed as public debt. However, post-Brexit, there's nothing to stop the UK deviating from this to reconcile contradictory electoral promises. Presiding Officer, the legacy of PFI and PPP are a stark reminder of the danger of prioritising short-term gains over long-term sustainability. We must never return to the tens of billions of pounds wasted on PFI and PPP deals in Scotland, ensuring that future generations are not burdened with the same mistakes. That Labour would even consider the return of PFI shows they cannot be trusted with Scotland's finances. The UK Government should rule out any return to PFI, and Labour in Scotland make their own opposition crystal clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. And moving to the open debate, I would advise members that we are tight for time given our 2 p.m. start this afternoon, and we must leave sufficient time for security staff to come and clear the chamber, so I must insist that members stick to their agreed allocated speaking time, which is up to 4 minutes. And with that, I call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Graeme Simpson. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I thank Kenneth Gibson for bringing forward his motion in order that we could have this important debate on the ongoing cost to the public sector of private finance initiatives, or PFI. First used in 1993 by the Tory Chancellor Kenneth Clarke and in 1997 adopted by Tony Blair's Labour government. Remember, Labour's reasons for adopting PFI was, as stated by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who struggled to provide a rationale for PFI other than, and I quote, "the public sector is bad at management and that only the private sector is efficient and can manage services well." Well, what's the reality of PFI construction projects here in Edinburgh and for my constituents of Edinburgh Pentlands? The Edinburgh Royal Infirmary was completed in 2003 and was one of the most prominent PFI projects in Scotland. Built at a cost of £184 million, the total cost to taxpayers over the contract's lifespan is significantly higher, with estimates suggesting payments could exceed £1.1 billion by the contract conclusion in 2027. So how's that contract performed? Well, in 2022, NHS Lothian said it was in dispute over the nature and delivery of the maintenance and upgrades required for the hospital. The issues placed on NHS Lothian's risk register warned that there is, and I quote, risk that facilities in the Royal Infirmary are not fit for purpose because of a failure to carry out required life cycle works and maintenance of the estate. The risk register lists heating, ventilation, water, window maintenance as some of the life cycle works that could present a problem. The Health Board at the time warned it could, if necessary, retain some of the PFI payments to Consort Healthcare if the issues are not satisfactorily resolved. However, the complicated deal for the hospital means that NHS Lothian will in 2027 enter a secondary contract period potentially lasting until 2053, where it will still pay a management charge to Consort Healthcare. Presiding officer, then there is the Edinburgh Schools debacle. In the late 1990s, Labour-run Edinburgh City Council embarked on a massive school rebuilding and refurbishment programme under PFI. The total capital cost for the project was around £140 million. The PFI deal was structured over a 30-year period, with the total cost over the life of the contract projected to be much higher, with estimates at well over £500 million when factoring in maintenance, operation and finance charges. In January 2016, during a storm, 9 tonnes of masonry fell as a gable end collapsed at Oxgangs Primary School in my constituency. Fortunately, no pupils or teachers were injured. This resulted in 10 primaries, 5 secondaries and 2 additional support needs schools being closed, impacting the education of around 7,600 pupils because of concerns over the standard of construction across the city. The impact of these PFI projects in Edinburgh have been criticised for their inflated costs to the public sector, often much higher than if the project had been constructed using public borrowing and public procuring. It's reported that Rachel Reeves may again be considering PFI. She should consider the words of a former chairman of RBS, Sir Howard Davis, who in 2018 made an admission on BBC One's Question Time when he stated that PFI had been, and I quote, a fraud on the people.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. I now call Graeme Simpson to be followed by Michael Mara. Mr Simpson, up to 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was feeling a bit lonely over there, as lonely as Mr Mara is, and I wanted to give my good friend Mr Mason some company, but apparently he didn't want it. So can I thank Kenny Gibson for bringing this debate to Parliament today. It's a very political motion, but I think that's fine. I think MSPs should be able to debate such things. He manages in the motion and indeed in his speech to savage both Labour and the Conservatives, but not apparently the virtuous SNP. Of course, he's entitled to that view. Perhaps he's seeking re-election. But for me, the serious questions raised here are entirely valid. And the main one being, do PFIs and PPPs represent value for money, and what happens when they end? So if I could take the first part of that, are they value for money? And there's not really an easy answer to that, because as Spice said in its blog on the subject in January 2018, for the 129 projects that have been privately financed in Scotland, repayment costs will total £39.7 billion, more than 4 times the capital value of the projects. However, they say, bear in mind that these repayments often cover more than just the construction costs and interest costs. They will include the costs of maintaining the building or other asset, and may also include other services such as cleaning and catering although this is less common with more recent projects.
Will you take an intervention on that point?
Absolutely.
Is it not a major concern that... thanks for taking an intervention, I should say. Is it not a major concern, though, that in many cases, after shelling out huge amounts of money for these projects, and I quoted Leaving Mouth at 16 times the original cost, these projects are not always owned by the public sector at the end of it?
Graeme Simpson.
Indeed, and I'm coming on to that. Now, the Auditor General and Accounts Commission said in their report of January 2020, using private finance contracts has enabled the Scottish Government to fund additional infrastructure investment. And they also said private finance costs more than traditional forms of financing, such as public borrowing or capital grants, but the Scottish Government has accepted these additional costs as part of its priority of investing in infrastructure. Now, Presiding Officer, a number of PFI contracts are due to end, with some needing a final payment to the private consortium. PFI contracts in the health service due to expire are Tippett Hill Hospital in Bathgate, New Craigs Hospital in NHS Highland expires in 2026, Carsview Centre in NHS Tayside and Larkfield in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde expires in 2027, Royal Infirmary Edinburgh 2028, Ellen's Glen House in NHS Lothian and Wishaw General in NHS Lanarkshire in 2029. And what happens after those dates is not clear. And that was evidence when I asked at the Public Audit Committee last year about the future of the Police College at Jackton in East Kilbride in my region. That contract is due to end next year, but when Neil Rennick, the Director General for Education and Justice, wrote to the committee on July the 26th, he was not clear on what the costs would be for exiting, instead using a lot of government speak and talking about options, negotiations and a business case. It's important that we have greater clarity. And looking ahead, and this is where Mr Gibson should be cautious, we have the mooted mutual investment model, which will apparently be used to fund parts of the A9. I call that a rent-a-road scheme, and if we don't get it right, then the same gripes about value for money and paying over the odds will just resurface.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I now call Michael Mara to be followed by Ross Crew. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate brought by Kenneth Gibson to the Chamber. He uses this time very usefully, I have to say, given his, the long view that he brings as a long-term member of this Parliament, but also his service in local government. After 14 years of Tory stagnation and decline, we can all agree that there is a vital need to drive growth and rebuild our public services. We have a Scottish NHS in perpetual crisis, crumbling schools and overcrowded prisons. And tackling these problems will require significant capital investment. And this government and the next Scottish Government will work with alongside the private sector and the public sector to deliver them. And I know Mr Gibson agrees that analysis. He set some of that out in his speech. The first PFI contracts to which Mr Gibson referred at length and rightly were written when I was in school. In a secondary school, starting secondary school in Dundee in St John's High School. They have been around for a very long time, and Mr Gibson and other members are right to refer to the fact that many of them are still with us. And it's essential that we learn the lessons, I think, that members are already setting out about the value in those contracts over time. And in particular, I think, well set out historical examples in the context at that time as to why some of those decisions were taken. But there is no doubt that those contracts still have a heavy burden on council taxpayers in parts of Scotland, as much as many constituents continue to use the facilities that are in place. So the UK Chancellor, I can say absolutely unequivocally, has confirmed that there will be no return to PFI under her tenure. And I've seen the reports that are referenced in the motion, but the Chancellor has been quite clear at that. And the Treasury, and Mr Gibson pointed this out as well, is at a time of constrained public finances for different reasons in regards to the advent of the UK Labour government in 1997, has to make sure that we can get public finance off the ground to make sure we get key projects working and get the economy growing. And again, that's an agenda I think that many people would agree with. And it is right, though, that we do draw that distinction between those original early PFI arrangements from a generation ago, and it is a generation ago, and the subsequent arrangements between public and private sectors to bring capital investment to the table. The non-profit distribution model is a variation on that core principle. And it has to be said that SNP government's involvement in those public-private arrangements dwarfs that of the previous Scottish Executive on the basis of longevity alone. And no SNP member can credibly claim that the dealings of this government with the private sector have been trouble-free. We should be honest about that, from Ferguson's shipyard, the Lochaber smelter, and now a private company suing the Scottish Government for the disastrous mishandling of this administration of the DRS scheme. The taxpayers on the hook for hundreds of millions of pounds. But we also have to think about this government's chronic failure to deliver major capital projects, shedding some light on the chamber clearly at the moment for everybody's benefit. The A9 remains something of a Sisyphean task for this government, although, to be fair to Sisyphus, at least he was doing something. Barlinnie's replacement is now costing 10 times the original estimate. NHS capital projects are frozen with no clarity for patients or staff as to when major projects will even begin. And the Scottish Government's capital spending plans, crucially first promised, Presiding Officer, in December 2023, have still not materialised. So yes, crucially the manner in which these things are done is hugely important, but actually doing them would be a start.
Thank you, Mr Barrett. I would advise members we are looking into the sudden increase in the light in the chamber, and hopefully we can resolve that. I call Ross Greer to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and my thanks to Kenneth Gibson for giving us the opportunity to debate the issue of PFI legacy debt today. Being generous, PFI was introduced by governments for the right reasons, or at least with the right motivation behind it, a need to improve our public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, etc. And it certainly compares well to what we've just seen under 14 years of Conservative governments, slashing capital budgets, a huge decrease in investment in our national, both public and private, infrastructure, and all the economic damage that came about as a result of that. But it has left us with a heavy burden. In 2023, it was reported that there will be £8.5 billion paid for £2.9 billion worth of infrastructure in Scotland. The English NHS will pay back £80 billion for £13 billion of infrastructure. That's according to the IPPR. And it's not just a case of a transfer of money from the public to the private sector. Much of this money has been transferred out of Scotland and out of the UK entirely. There's a huge amount of evidence showing PFI profits being offshored into tax havens. So there is no benefit to the UK economy whatsoever, not even to private businesses based here. In 2019, the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, announced that the government would consider setting up a national infrastructure company as one of the ways to move away from that model. And the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland were tasked with considering this, but in the end they recommended against it. But we do need an alternative. We need to look at how we can fund this critical infrastructure. Giving the Scottish Government the same prudential borrowing powers that local councils have would certainly help, but of course any borrowing does result in a debt that needs to be paid. And in 2019, at the same time as the then First Minister made that announcement, Parliament also passed the Planning Act. And as part of that Act, it created a power to allow local government to levy an infrastructure charge, an infrastructure levy, against private housing developers. If they were to profit from the creation of large numbers of houses, then it was only right that they make a contribution towards the local services, like schools, like health centres, that would be required to create that community. So I was disappointed when the government announced last year that the introduction of the infrastructure levy power was being dropped, though I'm grateful to the Public Finance Minister for his offer to meet with me to discuss this, because I don't think the existing Section 75 contribution arrangements are in any way adequate. That's why we as Parliament agreed in 2019 to introduce that power to fund that critical local infrastructure. There are other ways that we can address this, though. We could make existing processes more efficient. So I think there's a lot to learn from the Learning Estate Improvement Programme, for example, the collaboration between Scottish Government and local government, having that central resource for local government to help them manage projects at every stage, from the design, the financing, the management of construction, then the management of the asset. That would be incredibly helpful to councils who cannot ever realistically have all the skills and expertise they need for these projects in-house. And I do recognise that when the SNP came in, they tried the non-profit distributing model. I'm not quite as positive about that as Mr Gibson. Again, I think it was well-intended, but Dumfries Hospital is a good example of it not really working in practice. It has not effectively capped those profits. Now, many PFI contracts do have punitive clauses contained within them. We've heard that already from Mr Simpson. Not all, though. In 2004, the then Scottish Executive did end the Skye Bridge contract and bring that back in. So I would, in closing, ask the Scottish Government if they would work with local authorities to review which PPP contracts could be brought back in or could be cancelled early at reasonable value to money for the taxpayer. This was done in Greece off the back of their financial crisis in 2015 with some of their odious debt. There's no easy way out, but we do need to reduce the toxic legacy here and to be honest about how we develop the alternatives to pay for the infrastructure that we all agree is required.
Thank you, Mr Greer. I now call Marie McNair to be followed by Colette Stevenson. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to my colleague Kenny Gibson for securing this important debate, and like me, Mr Gibson has concerns about the negative impact that PPP and PFI burden has inflicted on the public sector. It's yet another real example of Labour's desire to replicate Tory party policy. Presiding Officer, this debate today serves as a stark reminder of why the Labour Party cannot be trusted to manage Scotland's finances. PFIs and PPP have left a harmful and lasting legacy in Scotland, first introduced under the Tory Westminster government in 1990 and fully embraced by the successive Labour governments in Westminster and Holyrood. These were posed as effective solutions but have instead burdened Scotland's public services and taxpayers with unsustainable financial sums for decades. According to Professor Kieran Conley, they have produced projects with assets worth £60 billion, which are costing the taxpayer £170 billion. That's a gap of £110 billion between the assets are worth and what the taxpayer is paying for them. Costs obviously end up getting passed on to the taxpayer, which, according to Professor Conley, can constrain what authorities such as the NHS can spend on essential services, forcing them to reduce budgets accordingly. And it's also created pressure to reduce project costs, leading to poorer infrastructure. And this also impacts on local council budgets. In my own area of Clydebank and Mulgai constituency, 37.9% of all council tax in East Dunbartonshire and 41.2% of council tax in West Dunbartonshire goes to PPP payments. Labour's financial mismanagement has led to severe consequences, and their wasteful PFI deals have footed a £30 billion repayments bill on Scottish taxpayers, forcing us all to pay many times more than the original cost of the projects. The funds used to pay for these agreements would have been much better spent on our public services to support education or to tackle child poverty. Instead, it was left to the SNP to fix Labour's mess, and under the SNP Scottish Government, we moved away from this model to a model which, importantly, does not see the surpluses going into the pockets of big investors, as Labour allowed. One perfect example is the hospital car parking charges, a terrible legacy of PFI, and under the Scottish Government, we scrapped the hospital car parking charges which were in place because of Labour PFI deals. Scotland continues to pay extortionate amounts for Labour's incompetence, with the figures in 2023 shows that the amount still owed under PPP for hospitals and schools is still £15.4 billion, not even half of Labour's eye-watering total PPP bill. Presiding Officer, these contracts are not just an enormously expensive way to borrow, but they're often inflexible. A 2019 report by JPI Media Investigations found that schools, hospitals and police forces have been locked in the iron grip of contractors, paying extortionate extra charges. Examples within this report found the school being charged £25,000 for 3 parasols and a hospital trust paying £5,500 for a new sink. These contracts are extremely profitable to the private sector, but not for the taxpayer. So nearly 18 years after Labour were kicked out of office in Scotland, we are still paying that heavy price for the disastrous PPP contracts. The Scottish taxpayers have had to shell out enormous sums of money above the actual cost of projects, all while PPP contractors hoard huge profits. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, it's quite clear PPP contracts have been disastrous for Scotland's public finances. So it is welcome that the Scottish Government recognise these options for what they are, extremely poor value for money, and something that is certainly not in the best interests of the Scottish people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNair. I now call Colette Stevenson to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very grateful to Kenneth Gibson for bringing this debate today. PPP and PFI are long-term contracts where public sector organisations pay annual charges to private companies for capital projects like schools and hospitals. These schemes were introduced by the Conservatives but enthusiastically rolled out by previous Labour governments. And with the Scottish Government continuing to face the most challenging financial situation since devolution, it is right that we look at the drain of the repaying dodgy PFI deals. Labour have not been in government in Scotland for 18 years, yet Scotland's public services have been saddled with well over £14 billion in repayment charges since Labour left office. Indeed, as Mr Gibson's pointed out, a shocking £1.25 billion will be repaid in PFI and PPP charges by Scotland's public services in 2025-26. Over the years, private companies benefiting from these deals have distributed hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends to investors from their huge profits, diverting cash from frontline health, education, transport and justice services into the pockets of investors. So, focusing on East Kilbride, Holyrood Hospital was rebuilt over 20 years ago with a capital value of £68 million. Yet this year alone, NHS Lanarkshire will pay around £27 million in PFI charges for Holyrood. That is enough money to pay the salaries of around 850 new nurses. Shockingly, this deal is a 31-year contract, and overall it is estimated that repayments will total around £700 million for Holyrood, over 10 times the original capital cost, and an absolute disgrace. And it is not just the NHS that is saddled with large payments. South Lanarkshire Council is paying around £43 million this year. Yeah, happy to take an intervention.
Can I thank Colette Stevenson for taking the intervention? Does she agree with me that we need much greater clarity on what is going to happen when these deals expire, including for the large number of health service facilities?
Colette Stevenson.
Okay, thank you very much for that intervention. And yeah, indeed, I wholeheartedly agree that we do need more information in relation to when the contracts, particularly given the scale of the money that we're talking about here as well. So thank you for that. So again, in this year in charges for some schools, with almost 32.7% council tax receipts going towards as well PPP. And, but over the 30-year contract as well, the council will pay back an estimated £1.25 billion. And it's on its website, the Labour-run council boasts that it is among the biggest UK-wide education public-private partnerships. But perhaps it should be straight with the public when talking about local government financing. Dodgy Labour decisions of the past are an ongoing drain on public finances, and it gets worse. Despite warnings at the time that capacity would be an issue, the decision to merge 6 of East Kilbride's high schools into 3 super schools as part of this costly initiative is now having to be rectified, with more money to be spent expanding St Andrews and St Bride's High School. To conclude, Presiding Officer, Labour's obsession with PPP and PFI is reckless. Despite not being in government in Scotland for 18 years, these deals have had and will continue to have a huge impact on public services. Councils, health boards and other public bodies are on average paying back more than 3 times the original capital cost to private companies on long-term deals. But in East Kilbride, the Hearmyres Hospital deal offered a 10-fold return to investors. This is a shameful legacy of the last Labour Scottish Government, rightly kicked out of the office 18 years ago.
Thank you very much, Ms Stevenson. And I call our final speaker in the open debate, Christine Graham. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I congratulate my colleague on securing this debate. PFI, if you mention this to the public, will not mean much, but it matters. The acronym stands for Private Finance Initiative, meaning in practice, private companies build the likes of schools for local authorities, which entered into a contract to pay for the building over a period, often for decades. And this is key. Ownership only passing, generally speaking, contracts do vary, to the Council at the end of the contract. This seemed to Labour at the UK level a whiz of an idea, and was eagerly adopted by Labour when they were in power here. Shiny new schools, what's not to like? When the SNP came into government, it was ditched, and for good reason. PFI, build now, pay as you go, is actually meant, for example, that 3 schools in the borders, Eyemouth, Duns and Earlston, at a build cost of £72.5 million, will actually cost the Council, with annual payment obligations, £350 million by 2037, by which time the schools will be pretty old. It's rather like buying a car on HP. Always read the figures at the bottom of the contract. They can be eye-watering, and by the time you own the car, it's towards the end of its journey. It's the same for schools under PFI. In comparison, the new Gala Academy in Peebles High will not be built in this expensive manner. In Midlothian, I understand that PFI contracts for 5 schools are costing the Council around £1 million per month. I'll repeat that, £1 million a month. So we must never forget the ongoing damaging costs of these contracts, reducing by millions the funding Borders and Midlothian councils could use elsewhere and put to better use. Finally, these contracts often come with other tough provisions, such as paying for private maintenance. And now we see in England private companies shirking their contractual obligations for repair and maintain, particularly as these contracts come to an end. These financial burdens, bequeathed by Labour, remind us that not only are they making an economic mess now, they made it before. And Borders and Midlothian will for decades to continue to pay through the nose for that PFI mess. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Graham. I now rather call on the Minister, Ivan McKee, to respond to the debate. Up to 7 minutes. 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Kenny Gibson for bringing this important debate this afternoon, and to all members for their participation. Across the Chamber, I think we all agree on the importance of infrastructure investment, not just for today, in creating and supporting jobs and economic growth, but also to ensure Scotland's asset base is in place to support our community economy well into the future. The 2025-26 Scottish Budget sets out over £7 billion of capital spending to eliminate child poverty, grasp the opportunities of net zero, boost economic growth through our infrastructure plans and maintain high-quality public services and infrastructure. This includes using £167 million of financial transactions to support innovation and attract investment. Although this increase to the capital funding from the UK Government is welcome, it's set against a challenging fiscal context. We still face significant pressures on our capital budget. For example, high levels of inflation experienced in the construction sector have permanently increased the cost of delivering projects. The Scottish Government has always recognised that public-private partnerships are more expensive in cash terms than capital grant funding any particular project indeed.
Michael Mara.
Minister for giving way. Can he tell us why these capital procurement contracts are so much more expensive to deliver in Scotland than in other parts of the UK? Why is it that there is a particular gap, if he acknowledges that, between the cost of delivering a mile of road in Scotland as compared to other parts of the UK?
Minister.
Well, I did check that's indeed the case. So I don't know if he's talking about the cost of projects, which of course will depend on a number of factors, including geography and so on, or if he's talking about the cost of the private partnership itself, which of course is, I think, hugely expensive right across the UK for those projects. In 2007, the new Scottish Government administration made clear that the PFI approach used in the past had not delivered best value for the taxpayer in Scotland. It was made clear that PFI was an expensive mistake and no longer a feasible option. The Scottish Government moved away from using PFI for any new projects from May 2007 and announced the non-profit distribution programme in November 2010. Prior to the NPD programme, the NPD model had been developed as an alternative to PFI in Scotland, and 5 earlier NPD-type contracts were signed between 2005 and 2010. The NPD model was further developed by the Scottish Futures Trust, who also managed the NPD programme, and it's delivered through 2 channels, NPD itself and the Hub, between 2010 to 2021, when the last project became operational. In 2019, however, the Scottish Government signalled a new approach to revenue financing due to the implications of classification changes affecting the NPD programme. The classification changes meant that the revenue-funded NPD and hub models were to be classified to the public sector and subsequently no longer provided additionality. Revenue-funded NPD and hub models have not been used for any new project since. The only private finance approach currently available is the mutual investment model, which will be considered alongside a range of other financing approaches. We've always been clear about our concerns about the flexibility and value for money offered by historic PFI contracts. That's why we brought them to an end. The PFI contracts that remain operational are often complex and need active management, which this Government remains committed to doing. The termination of any PFI contract, I'll just come on to this point, the termination of any PFI contract, however, is a matter for the public sector body that awarded it. PFIs are long-term contracts where risk and reward are set at the outset. Early termination can be a complex and expensive process, and the costs of breaking long-term contracts are substantial, and each authority would require to consider value for money in that context. As a Government, we are committed to ensuring that contractual obligations are delivered and that contracts are as affordable as they can be. And that's why we asked the Scottish Futures Trust to support public bodies to optimise value for money for their PFI contracts. This assistance comprises training and support for contract managers, and SFT could also support bodies in realising contract arrangement improvements, including rescoping services and optimising risk transfer.
Graeme Simpson.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention. I mentioned the mutual investment model, and so has he. I wonder if he could very briefly explain why he thinks that model will offer value for money.
Minister.
The difference between other mechanisms, for example PFI and the mutual investment model, is that the public sector partner takes an investment share in the vehicle that's delivering the project, so that they're taking part of that investment and therefore sharing in the profits that come back due to that equity holding and the way that the project is funded and delivered. So moving on, the costs and benefits of pursuing public-private partnerships need to be thoroughly analysed in a transparent manner in an environment where our ambitions for Scotland's infrastructure assets outstrips our grant funding from Westminster. This Government will always explore options for delivering capital investment. As this Chamber knows, we have very limited capital borrowing limits, which again constrains our ability to use capital grants to fund asset creation and investment. The correct mechanism used appropriately can allow us to create additionality in the capital budget and see more investment in Scotland's assets than we would otherwise be able to deliver. They can transfer financial and maintenance risk from taxpayers to investors, and these risks can include project overruns, change orders, delays and anything else that may increase the cost of a project. But to help ensure we are considering all available options, the Scottish Future Trust was asked to examine new profit-sharing finance schemes such as the mutual investment model to help secure both the investment we need and, very importantly, of course, the best value in those models for the taxpayer. We're exploring whether to make use of the mutual investment model to invest in Scotland's infrastructure, and any use will be considered only where it provides value for money for the taxpayer. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government will never return to the PFI model because PFI was an expensive mistake and simply did not deliver the best value for the people of Scotland. The only private approach currently available is the mutual investment model, which shares those profits between the public and private sector, and that model will be considered alongside a range of other financial options, and we're exploring whether and how best to make best use of MIM to invest in Scotland's infrastructure going forward. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to all members for their cooperation in respecting the time allocations today, given our start at 2 p.m. So indeed that concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting until 2 p.m.